first order problem, not like income effects, right? So income effects are the last thing you want to throw in. You know what I mean? You want to throw in some explicit consideration of those constraints you're talking about. You know, so I'm just trying to say why income effects are not something we should be worried about. That might be something we should be worried about, credit constraints, but income effects are not.
Sorry, but
yeah.
What are income effects?
Income effects are like when a price changes, that not only changes how much you're going to substitute to that good, but it also changes how much income you have in total, and therefore might change your
income you have in terms of like endowment of the good or something.
Well, so I mean, when your price changes, we talk about income and substitution effects, right? Do you remember those? Income effects are the income part of that, rather than just the substitution part of it. So when we have a quasi-linear utility model, we're ignoring all income effects, right? Because we're just saying you have like some infinite supply of money, and you just value that at some amount, right? And and all you're going to do is just maximize, the total quantity of wealth you have, right? And what I'm saying is that for most intents and purposes, when we consider consumer surplus, we're assuming there's no income effects, because otherwise we'd have to have these compensated variation and equivalent variation. And for many other purposes, we consider quasi-linear utility models, and I'm trying to say why that's a useful approximation. Yeah, James?
So I'm not sure why his example is not more problematic
yeah.
than you suggest. If we put credit constraints into the model,
yeah.
And then we're trying to look at consumer surplus in a credit constraint world, then the relevant income is no longer going to be the lifetime earnings for looking at income effects. And so suddenly the income effect is going to become much larger.
That's not really true, because actually the relevant thing is like, what's the Lagrange multiplier on that credit constraint, and how is that affected by things, which is actually quite different than just a straight income effect. You know what I mean? It's like it's some other thing. I mean, it just depends on what the Lagrange multiplier on that particular credit constraint is, which is different thing than the Lagrange multiplier on your whole budget in welfare terms. You know what I mean? I mean, anytime you have constraints, right, you can represent them in terms of something like an income effect, right, when you think about welfare. But it's a little bit of a, it's like it's not the right term to think about is what's the effect of this on the constraint that I face, and what's that effect on my welfare? And that might be relevant in some contexts, but...
Okay, so but I mean that sounds like we're just saying that in this context, we wouldn't call it an income effect. I mean, so it would still be the case that I suddenly feel much poorer because the price of this thing's gone up in this period because I've got this credit constraint, and that's going to change.
Yeah, I mean, and you also have to think: is that constraint binding at this moment? You know what I mean, or not? And how binding is it? And that's going to affect what matters. You know, I mean, and so the point is that's the questions you should be asking yourself, not just the standard income effects type question.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
It's obviously that's the first order concern. I would have just thought if we took this and went, okay, I don't need to worry about income effects, so I'm just going to kind of throw them out of my model anyway. And then I go and make a model with credit and put credit constraints in there. And I kind of go, oh, well, I don't need to bother about the income effect because I already established that over there. Then we could start going wrong, right?
Yeah, no, that's right.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Right, like most of the goods in the world tend to be substitutes. And
well, that doesn't mean goods are substitutes. Substitutes and complements is separate from income effects.
But I mean, if usually income effects, when income effects tend to be strong, then it's going to be complements, right?
I really don't think those things are related to each other at all.
Okay.
Yeah. I think they're completely separable. Because, I mean, you can easily make things complements without income effects. You can make things substitutes with income effects.
How do you, I just couldn't think of how do you make complements?
Oh, I mean, u of x is equal to x times y minus p x plus p, that's complements.
Okay.
Okay, so I think what this basically says is that it's pretty much fine to use quasi-linear utility as an assumption unless we're talking about like huge things that affect the whole economy. And so what is quasi-linear utility? It means that utility depends on whatever we're considering in our particular problem plus money. And we just put money over on the side. We put no transformation on it. We have this linear thing in money, right? That's what I mean by no income effect. And this is effectively going to be the model we're going to be thinking about for much of the rest of the course. Okay. Now, is Bokar Ba here? No? There are a few situations where income effects do matter. So one thing is like lifelong macroeconomic interventions, or like anything that's going to affect sort of the overall growth of the economy by a huge amount, right? But that's mostly covered in macroeconomics, so it's not that relevant to this course. Another thing is things that affect a few individuals in a very concentrated way. And these are the types of things that show up in development economics, and that's one reason why income effects show up there. So you can sort of understand from this why some fields care about income effects and others really don't. Now, most of these courses, we're not going to be talking about either development or macro issues, and so it's not really relevant. And that's a great benefit because it makes everything much easier. It makes consumer surplus easy to calculate and aggregate across people. Pareto efficiency just becomes maximizing total wealth. Equilibrium is just going to be like individual maximization. And so none of the complicated issues about stability that we talked about earlier come up. But if we're thinking about a really big policy shock, you have to go back to thinking about income. Optimal taxation is one area like that because you're talking about really big changes. We'll study optimal taxation without worrying about it because quantitatively it ends up not making that much of a difference in the problems that we'll consider. But another thing is like setting up a constitution or a war for a country could be the sorts of things where this could really start to matter. Okay. So why do we care about comparative statics, and why do we care about thinking about whether income effects matter or not? Well, the reason is that many, or maybe even most problems in economics come down to some notion of incidence. And incidence can be studied using simple comparative static techniques and also using, and is very much easier to talk about in the context without income effects. Okay, so the simplest thing we can think about comparative statics with respect to, perhaps, is a unit tax. And a question is, who ends up paying that tax in the end? Now, that sounds like sort of a narrow problem in some ways, but there's a bunch of things that actually turn out to be equivalent to that. So for example, if we want to know about how the creation of a new product or a new market affects welfare, that turns out to actually be equivalent to incidence for reasons that you can look up in the paper that I sent you guys. Another thing is who gets the benefits of a market. Oh, that's exactly what I was already saying. How is the benefits of trade split, which is a similar thing. Another question is, imagine that one side of the market is well organized and able to do lobbying. Is that going to lead us to the right allocation across different markets that we might potentially create or not? Well, it depends on how different the incidence is across different markets that we might create, because that's going to determine the relative benefits and costs, the relative benefits to each of the two sides of the market. Optimal taxation of international trade also depends on this. And we'll discuss lots more applications of the logic of incidence throughout the course. So as with the correspondence principle, rather than going into the multidimensional case, which has more complicated math but has very similar intuitions, I'm going to talk about the one market case. When there are multiple markets, the ideas are going to be very similar, but you basically just need to have some matrices, and you need to weight by the quantities across the different markets. And I'm going to assume quasi-linearity for the reasons we talked about above. And we'll talk about incidence under different industrial organizations throughout the course. And in fact, that will be sort of a theme that will tie together many things in the course. And basic incidence under perfect competition can be summarized by 5 principles, which probably are going to be pretty familiar, but I want to sort of get in the habit of talking about things this way. Okay. So is Scott Mendelson here? No. Can someone else tell me what the distinction is between the physical and economic incidence of attacks? What's your name?
Dan.
Dan. Yep.
Basically, physical incidence means like how you actually like implement it, like whether you pay the tax, whether like the producer pays the tax, or whether the consumer pays the tax.
Exactly.
Economic is actually like who ends up paying it, separate from physical. And these and physical doesn't really matter at the end for the economic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you tax consumers versus taxing firms, basically the only difference is that in the latter case, prices will nominally rise by $1 more than in the former case. But what really matters is in the end, how much has the effective price to consumers changed and how much has the effective price to producers changed, right? The second thing, the second principle is that any revenue that's raised by a small tax is paid for by the consumers or the producers. Like the sum of what's paid by the two of them is equal to how much revenue you raise. That is, the burden is exactly, is split in some way between them, and that's the total amount of burden of the tax. The second thing, the third principle, is that how much is paid by the consumers and how much is paid by the producers depends on the pass-through rate, which is how much does the price rise to consumers, how much does the final price they end up paying rise to consumers. So in particular, let's imagine from now on, because we know that the physical incidence is irrelevant, that all taxes are paid by the producers. Then we can just define the pass-through rate as how much the final price to consumers rise when the tax increases. And let's call that rho. Then the amount that's paid by the producers is going to be 1 minus rho times the quantity, because that's how much the price that they end up getting falls by, multiplied by the quantity that they sell. On the other hand, the price to the consumers rises by rho, and we multiply that by the quantity that they buy. By the envelope theorem, right, that is how much each of the two sides pays. And so we can call the incidence the ratio of the change in consumer surplus from the little tax to the change in producer surplus from the little tax, and that's rho over 1 minus rho. Okay. So the fourth principle is that the pass-through rate is equal to 1 over 1 plus the ratio of the elasticity of demand to the elasticity of supply. And that follows from the basic supply and demand equation. Demand is equal to supply, where the price the supplier gets is the price to the consumer minus the tax. And Stieg, can you show me how we derive this equation from this equality here, either on the board or explaining it verbally? Or
Alright, so
you can do it on the board if you want.
I'm not really sure how to get started.
Well, so you want to use the implicit function theorem, right? Because you want to know how much the price changes when the tax changes. Okay, so on the left-hand side, right, we get dp, we get d prime times dp dt, which we defined as rho. On the right-hand side, we get s prime times dp dt, which is rho again, minus 1, right? Because when we take the derivative of the tax, we get 1. And then rearranging that, we can group the two pass-through rates on the same side. We get s prime over s prime minus d prime, which is the same as 1 over 1 minus d prime over s prime. And then we